Please, they took my mom, said the little girl to a biker. What he discovered is unthinkable. The streets were mostly empty, except for the occasional dog barking in the distance or the soft hum of a car passing by. Jake, a large man in his early 30s with a leather jacket and a worn helmet, rode his motorcycle slowly through the neighborhood. He had lived in this town for most of his life and knew almost every street, every house, and nearly every resident. Yet, despite knowing the town so well, Jake often felt a kind of restlessness on evenings like this. The calm made him uneasy, as though something was about to happen, something he couldn't yet see. Jake's motorcycle roared softly as he passed the small park near the edge of town. The swings swayed slightly in the evening breeze, even though no one was on them. That's when he heard a sound that made him freeze mid-turn, a small, trembling voice calling out, barely more than a whisper at first. "Please, help me." He stopped his bike immediately and looked around. There was no one in sight, just the shadows of the trees and the golden light of the setting sun. Then he saw her, a little girl, probably 7 or 8, running toward him. Her small frame shook with fear, and her tiny hands clutched a worn teddy bear as if it were the only thing keeping her safe. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and her clothes, though neat, were slightly dirty from playing outside. "Please, they took my mom," the girl said again, her voice breaking. Jake felt a jolt in his chest. He wasn't a man who got easily shaken, but seeing a child like this, so terrified and desperate, hit him hard. Without a word, he took off his helmet and knelt down to her level. Hey, it's okay. Slow down. Who took your mom?" he asked gently. The girl hesitated, looking around as though the people she feared were still nearby. Then in a small, broken voice, she said, Some men in a big van. They came to our house. I was playing in the yard, and they took her." Jake's jaw tightened. He had heard stories like this before in the news, but hearing it from a little girl in the flesh made it painfully real. He could see the fear in her eyes, the kind of fear that made children grow up too fast. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his own panic under control. He had to be calm, he had to be strong for her. "Okay," Jake said firmly. "I'm going to help you. Can you tell me your name?" "Leela," she whispered. "My name is Leela." "All right, Leela," Jake said, giving her a reassuring smile. "I'm Jake. You're safe with me, okay? I promise I'll help you find your mom." Leela's eyes widened slightly. She had probably never met anyone who sounded so sure, so confident, so ready to help. For the first time since the terrible event, she felt a tiny spark of hope. They walked together slowly, Jake keeping his hand lightly on her shoulder to guide her. He didn't want to scare her, but he also needed to get as much information as possible before it got dark. "Can you tell me exactly where this happened?" he asked. Leela nodded, pointing toward a cluster of small houses not far from the park. Over there." "Our house, it's the yellow one with the white fence," she said. Jake nodded, remembering the house. It was a small, cozy-looking home at the end of the street, with flower pots lining the porch and a swing hanging in the yard. He had passed it many times, waving to the mother, Mrs. Thompson, who always seemed kind and welcoming. The thought that something bad had happened there made his stomach twist. When they reached the house, it looked quiet, almost eerily so. The front gate was slightly open, swinging gently in the breeze. Jake carefully approached the gate, glancing around. There were no cars parked in the driveway, and the windows were dark. He could see that the front door was slightly ajar, as though someone had left in a hurry, or worse, as though someone had been forced out. Leela's grip on her teddy bear tightened. They came in and took her," she whispered, her voice almost trembling to nothing. Jake nodded slowly. "All right, Leela, I need you to tell me everything you remember, okay? Even the little things, everything helps." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I was playing with my doll outside. I saw a big van stop in front of our house. There were 3 men, I think. They were wearing masks. I didn't see their faces. They went inside, and then they came out with my mom. She was crying, and I couldn't do anything." Her voice faltered, and tears ran down her face again. Jake crouched down beside her. He didn't speak for a moment, letting her words sink in. Then he asked gently, "Did you see which way the van went?" Leela nodded slightly, pointing down the road. "Toward the warehouse, the big one near the old mill." Jake's mind raced. He knew the place she meant. It was abandoned and rarely visited, a perfect spot for someone trying to hide something illegal. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to think clearly for Leela's sake. "Okay, Leela," he said, standing up. "Here's what we're going to do. First, I need to make sure you're safe. We'll go somewhere safe while I figure out how to find your mom. Do you have anyone else you can call? A neighbor, a family member? Leela shook her head. No, just my mom. Jake nodded, understanding that the child was completely alone in this. He could feel the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, heavy but necessary. He knew he couldn't leave her alone, not for a second. He took out his phone and dialed the local police station. "This is Jake Harris," he said when someone answered. "I need to report a possible kidnapping. A little girl named Leela saw her mother being taken by strangers. I have her with me, and I have information on where they went." While he spoke, Leela hugged her teddy bear tightly, listening to Jake's calm voice. The fact that he was acting, calling for help, made her feel slightly less terrified. When he hung up, Jake turned to her and said, "Help is on the way, Leela, but I'm not going to wait around. I need to make sure we know exactly where they went. I promise I'll keep you safe." Leela nodded, trusting him more than she had trusted anyone since that terrifying afternoon. They began walking toward the road that led to the warehouse near the old mill. Jake kept his eyes peeled for any sign of the van or the men. He scanned the streets, the shadows, the abandoned lots, anything that seemed out of place. As they walked, Jake noticed the small details that might have been overlooked by anyone else. Tire tracks in the dirt road, footprints leading toward the warehouse, a discarded glove near the side of a building. Everything added to the puzzle he needed to solve. He kept a mental note of each clue, knowing it could make the difference between finding Leela's mom in time or not. "You're very brave, Leela," Jake said softly, trying to reassure her. "It's not your fault. You did everything you could." Leela looked up at him, tears still in her eyes but a tiny spark of hope shining through. Do you think I'll see my mom again?" she asked in a small voice. Jake paused, crouching down to her level again. "I promise you this," he said firmly. "I will do everything I can to make sure you see her again. We're going to find her, Leela. You just have to trust me." They continued walking, the sky darkening above them, stars beginning to peek out as the sun disappeared completely behind the horizon. The world seemed quiet, but Jake knew danger could be around any corner. Still, he didn't let fear stop him. He had a mission, to protect this little girl and to bring her mother home safely. By the time they reached the edge of the neighborhood, the warehouse loomed in the distance. Its windows were dark, and the walls were old and crumbling, giving it a menacing presence. Jake slowed down, letting Leela hide behind him slightly. He studied the building carefully, making note of any movement, any sign of the people who had taken her mother. "Stay close to me," he whispered to Leela. "We're almost there, but we have to be very careful." Leela nodded, gripping his jacket with her small hands. Even though she was scared, she felt safe with him. For the first time since her mother had been taken, she believed that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle even more heavily on his shoulders. He didn't know exactly what awaited them at the warehouse, but one thing was certain: he would not let anything happen to Leela. Not tonight, not ever. And with that determination, he took the first careful steps toward uncovering the truth, unaware that what he was about to discover would be more shocking than anything he had imagined. The warehouse loomed in front of Jake and Leela like a dark, silent giant. Its walls were old and cracked, and some of the windows were shattered. The moonlight reflected faintly on the broken glass, creating small glimmers that made the building look even more mysterious. Leela clung tightly to Jake's side, her small fingers wrapped around his jacket. She was scared, but she felt a little safer with him. Jake paused at the edge of the road leading to the warehouse. He took a deep breath and looked around carefully. There were no cars nearby, no sounds except the distant rustling of leaves and the faint hum of a night insect somewhere in the shadows. The place seemed abandoned, but he knew better. Leela's description had been clear, and his gut told him this was exactly where he needed to be. "Stay behind me, Leela," he whispered, bending down to her level. "I need you to stay very quiet, okay?" Leela nodded, her big eyes wide with fear and trust. She wrapped her tiny arms around her teddy bear, holding it close to her chest. Jake crouched low and began moving slowly along the side of the warehouse, keeping an eye out for any signs of activity. He noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt leading up to the large side door of the building. The tracks were wide, showing that a big vehicle, probably a van, had parked there recently. His heart sank a little. This confirmed that the kidnappers were still around or had been very recently. He moved closer, careful to make no noise. As he peered through a crack in the side door, he saw shadows moving inside. Jake's pulse quickened. There were at least 3 men inside, just as Leela had said. They were speaking quietly to each other, but he could not hear what they were saying. They carried boxes and bags, moving carefully as though hiding something valuable. Jake knew he had to stay calm. He couldn't rush in without a plan. He needed to make sure Leela's mother was safe before anyone noticed him. He took out his phone and sent a quick message to the police, giving them the location and describing what he had seen. Then he turned back to Leela. "We have to be very careful," he whispered. "The people inside don't know we're here. We need to find a way to see if your mom is safe without them noticing." Leela nodded, her small face determined despite the fear in her eyes. She had learned quickly that this man, Jake, was her only hope. She trusted him completely. Jake scanned the perimeter and noticed a broken window near the back of the warehouse. It was small, just big enough for him to see inside, but not to enter. Carefully, he approached and crouched down. Through the window, he could make out a large open space with stacked crates and some old furniture. In the corner of the room, he saw a group of women huddled together. His heart leapt when he recognized one of them, Leela's mother. "Mom," Leela whispered, pointing to her. Jake nodded, motioning for Leela to stay quiet. He observed the situation closely. The women were unharmed physically, but their faces showed fear. They were being watched by the men, who seemed to be making sure they didn't try to escape. Jake's mind raced. He had to find a way to get them out safely. He thought quickly, considering his options. The warehouse was large with multiple exits, but he couldn't be sure which doors were guarded. He noticed a small side door at the back that looked less used. It might be a way in or a way out. He decided to check it carefully while keeping Leela close behind him. As they moved, Jake whispered instructions to Leela. "You stay close to me and do exactly what I say. Do you understand?" Leela nodded again, her grip on her teddy bear tight. They reached the side door, and Jake slowly pushed it open just enough to peek inside. The room was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb, but he could see the women clearly. They were sitting on the floor, looking scared but alert. Leela's mother looked up, her eyes widening in shock and hope when she saw her daughter outside the window. Jake realized that the men had been distracted by moving some crates in the opposite corner. This was their chance to act. He took a deep breath and whispered to Leela, "I'm going to go in quietly and get your mom. You stay here and don't make a sound." Leela nodded, tears welling in her eyes, but she trusted him completely. Jake moved slowly inside, keeping low and silent. He reached the women, signaling them to stay calm. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm here to help. Follow me quietly and don't make any noise." The women nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. They gathered their courage and followed Jake toward the small side door. Leela's mother clutched her daughter's teddy bear tightly, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time since she had been taken. Just as they were about to reach the door, one of the men turned around, noticing movement in the shadows. Jake froze, his heart pounding. He slowly reached for a nearby crate and used it as a shield, keeping low to avoid detection. The man looked around, suspicious, but didn't immediately see Jake or the women. After a tense moment, he turned back to his task, giving Jake and the others a chance to move. Jake led the women out through the side door and into the night. The cool air hit them, making them gasp with relief. They were not completely safe yet, but they had taken the first step toward freedom. He motioned for them to stay quiet and move quickly toward a nearby wooded area that would provide cover. Leela ran ahead when she saw her mother, and the two embraced tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Jake stayed close, keeping an eye out for any signs of danger. As they moved through the shadows, Jake thought about what had just happened. The men inside the warehouse were dangerous, and he knew they couldn't be allowed to continue their actions. But right now, the priority was to get everyone to safety. They reached a small clearing near the edge of the woods, where Jake could see the lights of the town in the distance. He motioned for everyone to stay down while he assessed the situation. The women were exhausted and frightened, but safe for the moment. Leela's mother held her daughter tightly, whispering words of comfort and gratitude. Jake took out his phone again, contacting the police to update them on the situation. He explained that the women were safe and that he had visual confirmation of the kidnappers inside the warehouse. The officers assured him that they were on their way with backup. While waiting for the police, Jake spoke softly to Leela and her mother. "You're safe now. Help is coming and the people who did this will be stopped. You did the right thing by staying brave." Leela's mother nodded, tears still flowing. Thank you so much. I don't know what we would have done without you." Jake smiled, though his mind was still focused on the warehouse. "We're not done yet. We need to make sure no one else gets hurt. That's why the police are coming. But for now, let's just stay calm and keep everyone safe." As they waited, the distant sound of sirens began to grow louder. Jake felt a sense of relief mixed with determination. The authorities were coming, and soon the kidnappers would be caught. Leela hugged her mother tightly, feeling the warmth and safety she had feared was lost forever. Jake stayed nearby, watching over them, his heart swelling with quiet pride. He had promised to help, and he was keeping that promise. The night air was cool and calm, a stark contrast to the fear and chaos that had filled the day. Jake knew that the experience would stay with him forever, just as it would stay with Leela and her mother. But he also knew that courage, trust, and quick thinking had made all the difference. As the police cars approached, their lights cutting through the darkness, Jake nodded to himself. The next steps would involve justice and safety for everyone, but for now, he allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. They had survived the night. They were together. And that was what mattered most. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, echoing across the quiet night. Jake's heart raced, but he stayed calm. He knew the police were on their way, but he also knew that the danger wasn't over yet. The kidnappers were still inside the warehouse, and they might try to escape or harm anyone if they sensed help was arriving. Jake looked at Leela and her mother. Both were trembling slightly, their faces pale but filled with hope. He took a deep breath and spoke softly. "Stay close to me," he whispered. "Everything's going to be all right, but we have to stay careful until the police are here." Leela nodded, her small hand slipping into his. Her mother held her daughter's other hand tightly, as if afraid to let go. The three of them crouched behind a line of trees near the clearing, using the shadows as cover. Jake scanned the warehouse one more time through the gaps in the broken fence. The kidnappers were still moving inside, unaware that authorities were coming. He considered his options. The safest choice was to wait for the police, but he couldn't shake the thought that time was critical. Any delay might give the kidnappers a chance to flee or hide evidence. Jake knew he had to be ready to act if necessary, but he also understood the importance of patience. He turned to Leela's mother. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm and quiet. Your daughter is safe and help is here. Do you understand?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaky but determined. "I understand. Thank you for everything you've done." Jake gave a small nod. "Just stay behind me. We'll get through this together." The minutes dragged on. The sirens grew closer, but still, Jake could see the men inside the warehouse moving quickly and quietly, stacking boxes and carrying items to the back. They were clearly nervous, perhaps sensing something unusual but unsure what. Jake kept his focus sharp. He knew that these men were dangerous, but he also knew he had to stay strong for Leela and her mother. Finally, the flashing lights of police vehicles appeared near the edge of the woods. Officers jumped out, their voices firm and commanding. "Cedar Creek Police." "Everyone stay calm. We're here to help." Jake stepped forward slightly, raising his hands to signal that he was not a threat. The officers approached him, quickly assessing the situation. He explained everything he had witnessed, including the location of the women inside the warehouse and the description of the kidnappers. The officers nodded, clearly impressed by his detailed observations. "Thank you for your quick thinking," one of the officers said. "We're going to handle this from here. Can you keep the women safe until we secure the building?" Jake nodded. "Absolutely. They're right here." The police moved in carefully, forming a perimeter around the warehouse. They instructed Jake, Leela, and her mother to stay hidden in the trees, out of sight. Jake crouched low, keeping a protective hand on Leela's shoulder. Her mother clutched her tightly, whispering words of reassurance to her daughter. Inside the warehouse, the kidnappers seemed unaware of the growing danger. They continued moving boxes and checking the crates, completely oblivious to the officers surrounding the building. Jake could feel the tension in the air, a silent warning that anything could happen in an instant. Suddenly, one of the kidnappers looked toward a window, noticing the faint glow of flashlight beams outside. He frowned and whispered something to his companions. Jake held his breath, hoping they wouldn't detect the police presence. The officers remained silent, waiting for the right moment to act. Then, in a swift, coordinated move, the police announced their presence loudly, shouting for everyone to stay where they were. The kidnappers froze, surprised and panicked. They dropped the boxes they were carrying, hands raised in surrender. Officers moved in quickly, securing the men and ensuring no one could escape. Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. The immediate danger had passed, but he knew there was more to uncover. He watched as the officers led the women out of the warehouse, one by one. Leela's mother was among them, and the moment she saw her daughter waiting outside, her face lit up with pure joy. She ran forward, hugging Leela tightly, tears streaming down both their faces. Jake stayed back for a moment, allowing the reunion to take place. He had promised Leela he would find her mother, and he had kept that promise. But as he looked back at the warehouse, he realized that the story was far from over. The officers began searching the building carefully, checking every corner for evidence. Jake noticed something strange, a small locked room at the back of the warehouse, partially hidden behind crates. One of the officers pried the door open, revealing a shocking sight. Inside the room were more women, huddled together, frightened but unharmed. They had clearly been held for a long time, and their expressions reflected relief and disbelief at being found. Jake's heart sank as he realized the scale of what had been happening. This was not just a single kidnapping, it was part of a larger, more organized operation. The officers worked quickly to escort the women out of the building. Jake stayed close, helping to guide Leela and her mother to a safe area where they could speak to the authorities and receive assistance. He noticed the gratitude in the women's eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the role he had played in their rescue. Once the immediate rescue was complete, the officers began questioning the kidnappers. Jake listened carefully, piecing together the story from the fragments he could hear. The men had been part of a small trafficking ring, taking advantage of isolated towns and vulnerable individuals. Their plan had been methodical, but Jake's quick thinking had disrupted everything. As the investigation continued, Jake spoke with Leela's mother privately. She held her daughter close, her hands trembling as she recounted what had happened. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there," she said, her voice breaking. I thought I would never see her again." Jake shook his head, feeling the weight of the night's events. "You don't have to thank me," he said quietly. "I just did what anyone would do. The important thing is that you're both safe now." Leela clung to her mother, her small face pressed against her chest. "Thank you for saving us," she whispered to Jake. He smiled gently, ruffling her hair. "You were very brave too, Leela. You stayed strong, and that helped a lot." The police continued to work, documenting evidence and preparing the kidnappers for transport. Jake stayed nearby, making sure Leela and her mother remained calm and reassured. He could see the exhaustion in their faces, but also a renewed sense of hope. They had survived a terrifying ordeal, and now they had a chance to rebuild their lives. As the night wore on, the last of the officers finished securing the scene. The kidnappers were taken away, and the rescued women were escorted to safety. Jake finally allowed himself a moment to breathe, feeling a sense of closure for the immediate danger. But he knew that the impact of this night would stay with everyone involved for a long time. Leela's mother turned to him, tears still in her eyes. "You're a hero," she said softly. "I don't know how to ever repay you." Jake shook his head. "I'm not a hero," he said quietly. "I just did what I had to do. The real heroes are you and Leela for staying strong through everything." Leela smiled faintly, feeling the weight of the night begin to lift. She held her mother's hand tightly, knowing that they were finally safe together. Jake looked around at the scene, the police cars, the officers, and the rescued women. He felt a mixture of relief, pride, and quiet satisfaction. For a moment, the chaos of the night faded, replaced by a calm understanding that courage, quick thinking, and trust had made all the difference. Jake had stepped in when no one else could, and in doing so, he had changed the course of many lives. As dawn approached, the first light of morning began to illuminate the town. The streets were still quiet, but the sense of fear that had hung over the night was gone. Jake watched as Leela and her mother were helped into a police vehicle for further care and protection. He knew that their journey toward healing was just beginning, but they were together, and that was what mattered most. Jake turned back toward the warehouse, now empty and silent. The night had been long and difficult, but he felt a sense of fulfillment. He had kept his promise to a small, frightened girl and helped rescue her mother and others from danger. It was a night he would never forget, a night that proved that one person's courage could make a difference in the darkest of times. As he walked back toward his motorcycle, Jake thought about the lessons of the night. Trust, bravery, and determination could overcome fear, and even in the most frightening circumstances, hope could survive. He knew that Leela and her mother would carry that hope forward, just as he would carry the memory of their gratitude and relief. With one last glance at the rising sun and the quiet town of Cedar Creek, Jake mounted his motorcycle and rode away, leaving behind a night of fear transformed into a story of courage and survival. The first light of morning spread across the small town of Cedar Creek, painting the streets in soft shades of pink and gold. The quiet that had returned after the chaos of the night was almost peaceful, but Jake knew that the events of the previous hours would leave a lasting mark on everyone involved. He had watched Leela and her mother being taken to safety by the police, their faces a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and joy. But he couldn't leave just yet. There were still things to be done, questions to be answered, and a sense of responsibility that weighed heavily on him. Jake walked slowly back toward the warehouse. The building looked even more menacing in the light of day, its broken windows reflecting the morning sun. The police had secured the area, and officers were still inside documenting evidence and speaking with the rescued women. Jake paused for a moment, watching the activity. He felt a mixture of relief and lingering tension. The danger was over, but the full impact of the night's events was only beginning to sink in. He thought of Leela, her small hand wrapped tightly in her mother's, and the courage she had shown despite her fear. It amazed him how a child could face such terror and still hold on to hope. He knew that the bond between mother and daughter had only grown stronger because of the ordeal, and that thought gave him a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had promised to help them, and he had kept that promise. As he stood there, one of the officers approached him. "Jake, we can't thank you enough," the officer said. "Without your quick thinking and bravery, things could have turned out very differently. We're going to make sure the investigation is thorough and the kidnappers will face justice." Jake shook his head. "I didn't do anything special," he replied quietly. "I just did what I could. The important thing is that they're safe now." The officer nodded, clearly impressed by Jake's humility. "Still, you helped save lives tonight. That's something that can't be overstated." Jake gave a small nod and turned his attention back to the warehouse. He could see officers carefully going through the rooms, finding hidden areas and documenting every detail. It was clear that the kidnappers had been organized and had planned their actions carefully. Jake realized how lucky they had all been that he happened to be in the right place at the right time. Meanwhile, Leela and her mother were being taken to a temporary safe location, where they could rest, eat, and speak with authorities in private. The mother held her daughter close, whispering words of comfort and reassurance. Leela clutched her teddy bear, feeling safe for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She looked up at her mother and whispered, "Mom, we're safe now." Her mother smiled, tears in her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe, and it's all thanks to him," she said, glancing toward where Jake was standing nearby. Jake felt a wave of warmth at her words, but he quickly looked away, not wanting to draw attention to himself. He wasn't seeking praise or recognition. He had acted out of instinct and compassion, but seeing their relief and happiness was reward enough. As the day progressed, the authorities continued their investigation. They collected evidence, questioned the kidnappers, and ensured that all the rescued women were accounted for. It became clear that this operation had affected more people than anyone initially realized. Jake stayed nearby, offering support when needed and answering questions about what he had seen. His detailed observations had already helped the police understand the layout of the warehouse and the kidnappers' actions. While the investigation was ongoing, Jake thought about the lessons of the night. Courage wasn't about strength or size. It was about acting when it mattered most, even in the face of fear. Trust could make all the difference, as he had seen in Leela's unwavering faith in him. And hope, even in the darkest moments, could guide people towards safety and survival. By late morning, the last of the women had been escorted to safety, and the kidnappers were taken into custody. Jake finally allowed himself a moment to relax, though he knew that the emotional impact of the night would stay with him for a long time. He had been part of something extraordinary, something that had changed lives forever. Leela and her mother were brought back to the scene briefly, so they could gather some personal belongings from their home under police supervision. The neighborhood had started to come alive with morning activity, people walking their dogs, children heading to school. but the sense of relief and community after the night's events was palpable. Neighbors had gathered quietly, whispering among themselves about what had happened and expressing gratitude for Jake's actions. When Leela saw her old home, she hesitated. The memory of fear lingered, but she took her mother's hand tightly and stepped inside. They didn't stay long, just enough to collect what they needed and say a quiet goodbye to the place that had become a symbol of terror for one night. Jake stayed close, silently reassuring them with his presence. After they were done, the three of them stepped outside. The morning sun warmed their faces, and the fear of the night seemed to melt slightly in the light of day. Leela looked up at Jake and smiled shyly. "Thank you for everything," she whispered. Jake knelt down to her level and ruffled her hair gently. "You were very brave too, Leela. Never forget that," he said. "Courage doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you keep going even when you are." Her mother nodded, tears in her eyes. "You have a heart of gold," she said softly. "You saved our lives tonight." "I will never forget you." Jake shook his head, smiling faintly. "I just did what I had to do. That's all anyone can do when they see someone in danger." As they walked together toward the police vehicles that would take Leela and her mother to safety and care, Jake felt a sense of closure. The immediate danger was over, the kidnappers were caught, and the victims were safe. But he also knew that the experience had changed him. He had seen fear, courage, hope, and relief all in one night. He had witnessed the strength of the human spirit, especially in the young girl who had faced such terror and still held on to hope. The officers thanked Jake again, ensuring him that his information and actions would be part of the official report. The rescue would be remembered as a success, and the kidnapped women would have a chance to rebuild their lives. Jake felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that he had contributed to that outcome. As Leela and her mother were driven away to a safe location, Jake watched them go. He knew that the road ahead for them would include healing, recovery, and learning to feel safe again. But he also knew that they would face it together. The bond between mother and daughter had grown stronger through the ordeal, and that bond would carry them through the days to come. Jake returned to his motorcycle, taking one last look at the warehouse and the quiet streets of Cedar Creek. The town seemed peaceful again, almost as if nothing had happened, but he knew the memories of the night would linger. For him, the night would always be a reminder of the power of courage, the importance of trust, and the difference that one person can make in the lives of others. As he rode away, the sun fully rising and bathing the town in warm light, Jake felt a sense of hope. The nightmare had ended, justice was underway, and lives had been saved. The little girl and her mother had survived because someone cared enough to act, and that thought stayed with him as he moved forward. Later, as the day progressed and news of the rescue spread quietly through Cedar Creek, neighbors and friends began to talk about the bravery of the man who had helped. Some called him a hero, others simply said he had a good heart. Jake didn't mind the recognition. He was more concerned about the safety and healing of the people he had helped. Still, he couldn't deny a small smile at the gratitude in their voices. Even in the quiet moments that followed, Jake found himself thinking about Leela and her mother. He wondered how they were recovering, how their smiles had returned, and how the trauma of the night would slowly transform into resilience and strength. He hoped that every time they looked back at what had happened, they would remember not just the fear, but also the courage, the hope, and the kindness that had made their survival possible. That night, as Jake finally rested at home, he reflected on the chain of events that had begun with a single voice calling for help. A frightened little girl had reached out to him, and by listening, acting, and staying calm, he had helped save lives. He knew that the story would stay with him forever, not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of the extraordinary impact one person can have in the life of another. And in the town of Cedar Creek, life slowly returned to normal. The streets were filled with the laughter of children, the chatter of neighbors, and the quiet hum of daily routines. But in the hearts of Leela and her mother, and in the quiet gratitude of those who had been rescued, the memory of that night remained, a story of courage, trust, and hope that would never be forgotten. Jake rode through the streets one final time before heading home, the morning sun warming his back. He thought about how fragile life could be, and how important it was to act when it mattered most. Leela and her mother were safe, the kidnappers were caught, and justice had begun to unfold. That was enough for him. He had done what he could, and in doing so, he had made a real difference. As the town of Cedar Creek settled into the calm of the new day, One thing was clear. Even in the darkest night, courage and hope could shine through, and ordinary people could become heroes through simple acts of compassion and bravery. Jake parked his motorcycle and took a deep breath, the cool morning air filling his lungs. He knew that the story of the night would stay with him forever, but he also knew that life would go on. And as he walked toward his home, he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had helped bring safety, hope, and a chance for a new beginning to those who needed it most.